say good morning to you this morning. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through okay? Okay, great. It is great to welcome you here to Stoneshill Community Church, and we're in another installment of the story. What the story is, it's basically we're working through the entire Bible, the story of the Bible, and we're doing it in chunks at a time. And so right now we're in the installment called The Battle Begins. It's on the front of your bulletin, and it is chapter 7. There's a book called The Story, and you can acquire that book, and we have them here if you haven't already received one. So we invite you to make this great journey with us. Like I said, I'm Pastor Joey, and it's my privilege to talk to you each week out of the Bible, out of the story. In the YouVersion app, there are resources there, and some of the things I talked to you about today will in fact be included in those resources. So if you care to access those, they're right there for you. This is probably the thorniest installment of the story when it comes to issues. There's things that we have to talk about in this particular chapter installment of the story that we wouldn't have to talk about in other times and places. But it's important for us to work through some of these thorny issues early on, isn't it? And so we'll be doing that. When we look at as I look at all the things I'd like to share with you today, I'd just like to overview with you Joshua and his story. It's an intriguing, exciting story. And then we need to take a little bit of time looking at the so-called moral problem of the conquest. The moral problem of the conquest. How many of you like animals? You like animals? Yeah, I like animals. And boy, animals have a hard life in the book of Joshua, don't they? Especially the ones living in the land of Canaan. And so you like animals, and there's no more animals. You like babies and children, there's no more babies and children, at least for a specific people group. You like, you don't like the sounds of what's going on in this particular book, and it's not popular in the political agendas of today. It's not popular maybe to talk about some of these things, but we need to talk about that. And so we'll look at some of the moral problem of the conquest, and it's really kind of interesting. I looked at other churches that have done this and looked at some of the sermons and things related. Nobody will touch this, but we're going to touch it today. We need to, because it's a very important part of it. And then finally, I would like to revisit the Abrahamic covenant, because everything that we see in the story, especially today, how God promised the land to His chosen family that would make sure that the story of God to the world would be accurately recorded and presented without corruption to the world. Also, a promised messianic seed would come through them, and the Old Testament shows you how God goes about preserving this particular family and that seed, so that eventually we get the Christ child born in the world in the lineage of David and even the lineage of Abraham. And so we see all these multiple themes and plots and sub-themes and subplots that are working in the text, but it's important that we see this clearly, and I want to help us do that today. As far as Joshua, it's an intriguing story. Like I said, chapter 7, the battle begins, and Israel begins the conquest of claiming the promised land. After years of wandering, and on slide number 13, I pulled up this slide last week. How many times you and I, instead of taking the short route, we go the long way around. And I can understand why God would woo Israel into the wilderness, because He was going to propose marriage. In fact, He did propose marriage. They accepted. And so I can understand why they would detour on a honeymoon detour. But I don't understand is why it took 40-some years for them to actually obey and go into the land. Their hearts were hard. They're like you and me. We get something in our heads and we think it's got to be a certain way, and unless it's going to be that way, unless the road is going to be smooth and there's no mountains or valleys to go through, we're not going to go and do what God asks us to do. And so many times we are that way, aren't we, in our spiritual lives? Well, they were that way. They go in a circle. Eventually they under Joshua's leadership, and that's the little blue lines. That's what the little blue line is about. They come around on the east side of the Dead Sea, and then they begin to make their invasion into the land of Canaan, or the Promised Land. And the first challenge that they had, you can see Jerusalem there. That's the little bluish purple line, number 4 it's labeled. That's kind of the route that they were going to have to travel to go into the Promised Land. So you can see, and if you're familiar with the geography of the Near East, to the north there's the Sea of Galilee. It empties into a river called the River Jordan. I've actually seen that river. It's not that intimidating. In fact, it's about the size of the Elkhart. And so it's not that big a deal. And so when I read in the text about them having to cross a river, anywhere from 1 to 3 million people have to cross a river, I'm thinking, well, that's not that big a deal, right? I mean, it's not that big. I've seen it. I've been there. And there's parts of the Elkhart. I mean, it's, this deep in places and maybe a little wider in places than others. But you can do this. We can do this. No, they didn't have bridges, and they didn't have little devices to help, 1 to 3 million people across. But they could do this. It was definitely within the realm of their ability. But here was the problem. In Joshua 3:15, the writer Joshua tells us it was at flood stage. That's a game changer, okay? Big time. I'm from West Virginia, and I have seen little creeks turn into raging torrential rivers in just a few hours. And in fact, we had a river that went behind our house. We had a train track in front of us and a river behind us, and so we're kind of hemmed in. But there was one time where it's kind of like a flash flood, and you could literally ride a John boat around in our yard. And so we all had a little fun with that, riding a John boat around our yard. But that's the power of a flooding river or creek. It's a very powerful thing, and it's very intimidating. And that's where they were. And so, in fact, one year, my brother lost his bridge. He had a bridge, and you have to cross this thing, and he said a wall of water came down and just literally wiped it out in just a matter of minutes. And so it's a very powerful, intimidating thing. But God asked them, you never notice how God asks you to do the strangest things at the worst possible times? Sometimes He has a way of doing that. And I think it tests us in a lot of ways. But God said, no, I'm going to have you go across the Jordan River, and you're going to go now. This is the time. And it's at flood stage. All right? And then that's the first challenge they had. The second challenge they had, if you've done the reading for the week, is they had the challenge of the special rite of circumcision that God commanded this Joshua, and He commanded that they perform this right before they go into battle. Think about that. Circumcision wasn't something that was practiced in the wilderness wandering years, so the younger generation of Israelite men had not been circumcised. It was definitely a sign of the Abrahamic covenant. It was an outward sign in the body, on the body, of who they belonged to and the special calling that they had in the world. And they were heading into a land where there was a lot of fertility deities, and these deities, gods and goddesses, there were many, many rituals, actually sex rituals, just to be frank about it, that they would engage in. And one of the purposes of circumcision, not just as an outward sign of a covenant that God had committed Himself to, but it was also, if in the process of a male Israelite who would disrobe and choose to engage in some of those fertility practices and things, all the people would know, hey, wait a second, there's something strange going on with this person. All right? This guy is not like everybody else. What's the deal? And so I think that's part of the reason circumcision was such a big deal in this time. Yes, it was a sign of the covenant, but it was also a physical sign in the body when a person was going to do something along the lines of these fertility cults, gods and goddesses, and in the process of disrobing, this special mark would indicate that they belonged to God and they couldn't get away from it as easily. So here you've got it. You've got a river you've got to cross, and it's at flood stage. You've got this crazy rite that nobody has been observing for years, and now all of a sudden all your soldiers And your warriors, even though they're nomadic shepherds, they've probably manned up and tried to get ready for this. They are going to be circumcised right before the battle. And so if I got this right, they're going to march around a fortified city, they're going to blow trumpets, and they're going to shout. And can't you picture the team meeting with Joshua and all of his leaders when they're trying to get, he's trying to lay this plan out. I can just hear it now. Okay, guys, we're going to cross that raging river on the edge of town. We're going to do it without boats or bridges. And once we get to the other side, I want all the guys to meet me in a big tent. Bring your flint knives and a Band-Aid. Yes, be sure to bring that. And I'll explain later. Don't worry about it. And when we're finished there, we're all going to form this really big conga line. And we're going to parade around a huge walled fortress where soldiers will be waiting to ambush us on the other side. Okay? Don't bring your weapons. In fact, I want 7 of you to bring trumpets. And when I give the word, you guys will make some noise. And I think that'll do it. Who's with me? Who's with me? It's crazy what this young rookie general is being asked to do in light of this crazy scenario of them trying to get a beachhead into the promised land and the fortified city walls of Jericho are there in front of them. And this is a crazy, crazy plan. Well, God had to give Joshua a pep talk. And he says, Joshua, I'm with you. This may not make sense to you altogether now. Just do what I say. And with the 40 years of wilderness wanderings behind them and the rearview mirror, and not wanting to go through that again, that circle of wilderness loop stuff is not just for everybody, right? That's a tough way to go. They said, you know what, Joshua, whatever God says, we'll do. Whatever you ask us to do, wherever you send us, we'll go. And maybe sometime God will ask you to do something really, really hard. And see, these Israelites had a lot going in through their minds. And they had believed some lies about their past. They had to replace and dispel these lies with truth. And a lot of times, we face things like this. We face lies in our life. And it's tough to get through some of those. It's like crossing a river or breaking through a fortified city or doing something strange to get through it sometimes. Lies like it's too late for you, right? I'm sure they thought about that lie many, many times. You guys messed up 40 years ago. You waited too late. This is not going to work. You've got floods. You've got rivers. These guys have had 40 more years to reinforce themselves. This is crazy. And I'm sure some of them thought, it's too late for you. And maybe you've thought about that same lie. Maybe you've messed up too much. You ever heard that whispered in your ear? Maybe there's somebody here that's wrestling with that kind of a message, that you've just messed up too much now. There's no way to fix this. Maybe you've heard the words, no one will want you, or it's never going to happen. I'm sure they thought about that so many times in those wilderness years, that it's never going to happen. Maybe they heard, you will just fail again, or you're never going to change, or you will always be alone, or you've failed, or you've wasted too much time, or it'll be like this forever. Maybe you've heard those kind of messages. And maybe you've kind of believed some of those in your life. But what I appreciate about Joshua and what I appreciate about these people at this time is they had some fight in them. They had some energy to do what God wanted them to do. And there was a lot of things, a lot of notions they had to dispel and quiet in order to actually do what God asked them to do. And sometimes God asks us to do some hard things. And sometimes the hardest things we have to do is to identify and dispel the lies and the voices that we've listened to for so many years, that have tried to tell us we'll never be in a place where we can rest spiritually. We'll never be in that promised land kind of life, that Canaan kind of life. And maybe you've had to listen to those voices, and sometimes we succumb to them. But what I love about this story is that they obeyed. They simply did. what God asked them to do. And so you know the story. The priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant. It's a special piece of worship furniture. It represented the presence of God. And they stepped down into this torrential, flooded river. And when they step down into it and they stand in the middle of this thing, the water stops and it walls up. And just kind of like the Red Sea parting, it was the Jordan River in flood stage that was parting though. And it parted, and all those people crossed over into the land of Canaan. And I love how Joshua 4 says they hurried across while the priest stood there in the middle of the river holding God's presence. That's the piece of worship furniture representing God's presence. And then they obeyed God by circumcising every male before setting out on the notorious march around the city of Jericho. You know the story. 6 days they march, once around the city each day, and then on the seventh day they circle the city 7 times before the trumpet blast. And Joshua gave the command to shout, and they shouted, and as the old spiritual says, the walls came tumbling down, just like God said that it would. And the rest of the story of Joshua is all about conquest. They conduct a southern campaign. They wipe out 5 kings and their armies that banded together to fight the Israelites. And then they head north and they take on the alliance of 14 kings and their armies, and they decimated those cities. And Joshua divides the land among the tribes of Israel. So that's pretty much the story of Joshua. And you can read some of those things in Joshua chapter 13 through 21. So it's a very powerful testimony of God's faithfulness to give them the land, a land that He had promised many years before this, and even to Abraham via the Abrahamic covenant. Now, when we get to this part of the story, it's great to focus on the victory of it, but a lot of people see this part of God's story as a heartless and cruel thing. And we have to be honest with what we read. Donette was reading just the other, and she loves animals, I love animals, and she was reading just the other day. And it's like, she just hated to read about all the animals that had to get wiped out too. And maybe you've been there as well. And as we think about this, those kinds of things, those kinds of details in the story, we have to reconcile them with what we know and what we're understanding in the larger story, the larger framework of what's actually playing out here. And so I think it will help us if we look at slide number 4. We look at slide number 4, Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 5. After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, the text says, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. Did you read that? Okay, verse 5, it is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going in to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what He swore, that's covenant language, to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so although the Canaanites had been increasing in wickedness for more than 700 years, God had exhibited His grace over and over again during this period of time. But there came a time where judgment and accountability had come. And so God can't allow an alternative story to sabotage the true story of the world. Something had to be done. And what you have to bear in mind is that God has been gracious. He's been gracious for centuries. He had put up with their decadence and depravity. And I'm not going to read Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 18. They're in your YouVersion resources. And you can also reference them in the Bible if you want to go read all the gory details for yourselves. But these were people, these were tribes and people groups who were given to decadence, they were given to depravity. This included bestiality, it included widespread prostitution, it included homosexuality, it included incestuous relationships, and there are many scholars who will verify these kinds of details in the historical study of this particular location and period of time. But there finally came a time when God held them accountable, and He used His own people to do so. Now later on, God will use other nations to hold His own people accountable, and that's when they really struggle to find the presence of God. But there's some things to consider as we think about this, and as we dig into it a little more deeply, we understand something about this particular society that maybe a lot of people don't understand. And that is that it was a revenge-driven society. Here's how it worked. If you didn't avenge your family member, and you did not avenge their death, then you betrayed not only your family, but you betrayed the whole tribe and the whole clan. And you were not loyal as you should be to your blood relatives. And so they were taught this from your birth onward, that if anybody did anything to any of our family, you had to avenge the death. So to leave any of them alive, no matter what their ages would have been to have charged them with the responsibility of killing the Lord's people, of murdering the Lord's people once they got old enough to avenge the deaths of those that were in the land. And so it was a revenge-driven society, and this is part of why God has to hold this people accountable so aggressively. And then the resources of the time would not permit massive incarcerations. They didn't have advanced penal systems like we have today. And those who would engage in all the depravity of the Canaanites, there was no place to incarcerate them and still have a safe place to live. They couldn't have these massive prison systems. They couldn't show mercy through life sentences and things. It wasn't set up that way. And so we have to understand this. When we try to understand the so-called moral problems of the conquest, there was these dynamics that were working in this particular culture and time. And so God is working with a particular group of people who with particular sets of beliefs and in a particular culture at a particular time. And this is how it had to go down. This is how the story has to roll, in order for God to ensure that you and I get to stand here and have an accurate story and talk about a true story that doesn't come to us with corruptions and that doesn't come to us with inaccuracies and things. And this is part of His plan of preserving a people who could keep that story right. And then I think another thing that we see here as we try to reconcile the so-called moral problems of the conquest with what we have here, the details of the text, they did practice child sacrifice, and Leviticus 18 tells us this. And if your culture endorses this kind of abhorrent practice, God holds that culture accountable. 700 years. And finally God says it's enough. And He uses His people to hold them accountable. And then also keep in mind that just because a group of people are taken in judgment, and even the children taken in judgment, it doesn't mean that all the children went to hell. I think a lot of people have that erroneous notion that they all went to hell, and I don't necessarily think that. I just think that they had to pay a price for the decisions that their parents had made. And then finally, the Canaanites had to be destroyed because God had made a promise. And He had made a promise to not only hold, that He's righteous and not only hold the world accountable, but again, to make sure that you and I have a story that we can celebrate today. And I know it's dark, and I know there's some hard minor chords that are played in this great drama and this great musical masterpiece of the story. But I want to show you that even in all of this, there's a God at work in our stories, and a God at work in all the depravity that sneaks its way and oozes its way into our stories. And a lot of people, when they land in this part of the story, the battle begins, and all the things associated with this part of our story. A lot of people will make this comment, and they've shared it with me in various ways over the years. And they'll say something like this: it seems that God of the Old Testament is so different from the God of the New Testament. Why is that? And I'll hear that quite a bit. The God of the Old Testament is so different than the God of the New Testament. Why is that? And then I have to talk a little bit about an ancient covenant. to help clarify and answer that question. In fact, we'll look at a couple of passages here that I'm going to help you see that in fact the warrior God of the Old Testament was a God whose sacrifice was planning a great sacrifice himself someday to resolve our sin issues. And as we look at this, last week we had looked at slide number 7, if you would. Slide number 7 in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 through 20. And again, we think about, what would I say to those who say the God of the Old Testament is so different from the God of the New Testament? And what I would do is I would take you to this ancient blood covenant that God made with Abraham. And I'm going to show you here how God Himself seeks to remedy all the brokenness, all the kinds of things that are caused by, we could say, Canaanite lifestyle and living. All those things, broken things that find its way into our families and things. How all this brokenness eventually gets resolved. And we read last week in Deuteronomy 30, 19 through 20, how that the blessings and curses were set before them, and Moses said, choose life. And he says, for the Lord is your life, verse 20, and He will give you many years in the land He swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's covenant language. And why does Moses say it this way? He's taking us back to the time that God made a promise via the Abrahamic covenant to give Abraham a land, a seed, and a blessing. And we read on slide number 9, if we look in slide number 9, we see this Abrahamic covenant spelled out in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. All the people of Babel, back in Genesis, early chapters, wanted to have a great name. And God said, no, I'm going to scatter you. And then He picks this one nation that refused to be polytheistic and that refused to be pagan, that refused to, or a man that would refuse to do these things. He would turn his back on all of that and be a special family that would evolve into a special nation that would eventually bear a story that we all would need to hear and to know and to experience. This was the promise that He made to Abraham. And He says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And then what we see, guys, is that the covenant He made to Abraham was ratified and reaffirmed. It was reaffirmed in Genesis 13. It was reaffirmed in Genesis 17. It was reaffirmed in Genesis 22. It was reaffirmed in Genesis 26. But I want to take you to Genesis 15 because this was the actual ratification of this covenant. And we get insight into God's heart. And so we could say that the warrior God of the Old Testament he's slain here in this ratification ceremony. This warrior God who seems to be so contradictory to the New Testament God of love, and yet we see these strands of love being worked into this ratification ceremony in Genesis 15, where God is talking about ratifying the Abrahamic covenant via a blood covenant. And it was one of the most intense and solemn kinds of covenants. And in those days, the way you took an oath wasn't by signing something. They didn't have very many writing tools, and so you didn't sign something and have it notarized. One of the things that you would do when you did ratify these kinds of covenants, you would have special ceremonies, and because you didn't have a lot of writing tools, you would act out the ceremony. You would act out the blessings. And you would act out the curses. And you would have this drama-filled event with witnesses observing. And so if you wanted to do something major like a blood covenant, you had to do drama. It was a physical action that everybody could see. And you could see the consequences of breaking your vows to the covenant. And so you would act out this covenant and the curses of the covenant. And so this made blood covenants very, very messy affairs. But we read on slide number 10, if you would look on slide number 10, it's Genesis 15. Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of the land? How can I know that you're going to give it to me? I believe you about Isaac, or I believe you about a son that's going to be given, but how can I know that the land will be ours? How can I know that someday there'll be a general who will take us into the land, who will claim this land, who will break the backs of those who would stand against your story in the world, who would defeat them? How can I know you're going to do this? How can I know? And God says, okay, here's what I want you to do. Bring me a heifer. Verse 9. Bring me a goat. Bring me a ram. Each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. I want you to bring these animals to me. And Abraham was a smart guy. He knew what God was setting up here. And what was unusual to him was the fact that it wasn't just one animal, which was typically, it was just one animal for a blood covenant like this. It's 5 animals. And so he's like, whoa, wait a second. What's going down here? What is Yahweh God asking me to do? And why is this whole ceremony intense like this? And why is it involving more animals than it usually does? Abraham brought all of these to him, verse 10, and cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite each other. Again, he knew what God was going to do. Again, they're acting out in a dramatic way a promise that God was making. And he arranges the animal halves opposite each other to create a primitive aisle that you could walk down. And the animals were cut in half, and they were placed opposite of each other, and the blood would form in a so-called blood path. As they observed this taking place, everybody would be watching, and they would see this ceremony playing out, and they knew it was a visualization of something powerful and something important. And so the two parties would come together, and the greater party who established the terms of the covenant, he would walk through first. And the lesser party who would either accept or reject the terms of the covenant, he would walk through the blood second, as a way of saying, may what was done to these animals be done to me if I don't keep my side of the covenant. It was an ancient method of Abe's time, and it was graphic stuff. And in other words, the covenanters would invoke on themselves this kind of penalty of death. If one party would walk between the pieces of the animal and decide not to keep their side of the covenant, it would be a visualization of the curses invoked on their lives for refusing to keep their side of the covenant. And so to restate, the covenantal parties would walk through the two halves as part of the covenant ceremony. And they would pass through the pieces of the calf. And the covenant makers were in effect saying, God, do to me what's been done to this animal if I don't keep my part of the covenant. You know, the next time you have some work done on your home or your apartment or maybe your car, you could just say to your person that's thinking about doing the work, let's just do away with that old paper and pencil thing, okay? Let's do ancient blood covenant. Why don't we, right? And lay out a few animal halves and make them walk through them and explain, this is what will happen if you mess up my plumbing, my electricity. If you screw my car up, this is what's going to happen, okay? Let's just see if that wouldn't get maybe a little more quality work done in that particular situation. Listen, I would suggest and propose that it's probably going to be done at a little more quality level, and that there are some drawbacks to civilization, I guess, and this is maybe one of them. And that is that in this particular day and time, they visualized it and they dramatized it. They didn't want the people to miss how important this promise was. God didn't want Abraham to miss something he was getting ready to do here. The blood path rite was also typical for arranging marriages in the Middle East. And in some desert communities to this day, they practice the art and the drama of the blood covenant. A historian, Dr. Ray Vanderlaan, describes in detail how that even to this day, the bride's father, the lesser covenanter, will walk through, and he basically assures that this bride is ready for marriage. I can vouch for her chastity, and I can vouch that she will make a proper wife. And then the groom's father will splash through that blood path and say, I have prepared this groom. He is ready. I can vouch for him and who he is and what he's about. And to this day, in some primitive places, they still practice the blood path covenant that we're reading about here in Genesis 15. And you know what's really interesting is that when we do marriages today, we see a lot of similarities between the ancient blood covenant of Genesis 15 that God does here with Abraham. We see a lot of those things carry over in a marriage ceremony today. In fact, just like the participants of an ancient covenant walked through the bloody halves of animals in biblical times, have you noticed that a bride will walk down the center aisle between the halves of the two families? Where does that come from? Genesis 15. Have you ever noticed how there's a white aisle runner to symbolize it's holy ground, definitely holy ground, what God was doing with Abraham in Genesis 15? Have you ever noticed how the father gives away the daughter bride? And that's significant. Have you noticed the layers of witnesses? The best man, the maid of honor, then the groomsmen and bridesmaids, and then the congregation? It's all taken from this ancient blood covenant, clear back in Genesis 15. Well, so many times I think we enter a marriage ceremony, and we have special clothes and decorations and food and family. And then if we pull apart and take a path where we go another direction, we just kind of slip into that. We do maybe a few legal things sometimes, and then we go our separate ways, and there's nothing really that dramatizes the breakup. Have you ever kind of noticed how that works? And I'm not so sure, but what maybe a visualization or some drama somehow taken from these ancient covenants. Maybe the same idea could happen. You know, a few years ago, I was really, really discouraged about just how it seemed that families were going through tough places and having to separate families and things. And as a pastor, you see a lot of that. I was laying in my bed one night, and I thought, in light of this, what we've read here, what if there was something more done that could help people picture what it would mean to go a separate way, to leave a spouse and to go another life direction? What would happen? And so I just, in my bed on that evening, I just pulled out a pen and paper, and I thought, I'm going to write out a divorcing declaration. I'm going to call it Wedding Vows Upended. And I'm going to dramatize, and in my mind, I was just dramatizing. Like I said, we come into marriage with these fantastic celebrations, but we kind of ease out of it without anything that helps distinguish what's happened. Kind of like when we do, kind of the opposite of the way it is when we get married. And so in my mind, I see children and family present as witnesses. And I see a husband and wife standing and facing one another. And then I just wrote these words. And it's in your YouVersion app notes. And you say the name. I will not take you, and you say the name, to be my wife or husband. I will not hold you. I will not have you. I will not love you. I will not cherish you. I will not be there for you in bad times. I will not be there with you in better times. I will not help you financially unless court mandated. I will not assist you in poverty. I will not hold your hand in sickness. I will not celebrate your healthy life. I will not be intimate with you ever again. I will offer no emotional support. You're on your own. And while you still have so much potential for good, our marriage is over. Let the reality of this sink in. No more family pictures, trips, or vacations together. No more letters, dates, or gifts. No more daily conversations, weekly highlights. And in my mind, I'm just seeing this play out. Somehow, could we create a drama-filled moment that would help couples realize what they're getting into? No more monthly restaurant meal times or yearly getaways. And yes, our kids are going to be negatively impacted by this. It's a reality of life. We can't avoid it. In my mind, I'm seeing the drama of this, and I'm trying to recreate it. My covenant with you is now broken. I now turn my back to you as a token of my rejection. I surrender my ring from my finger to show that my husband-wife love for you is ended. It is now over. The sad ending has come. I will die happier without you in my life. We are witnesses to the death of a marriage. The pastor or the person presiding over the divorcing would declare, I now depronounce you man and wife. You may walk away forever. You may abandon all that might have been. If you cannot do this, we can transition to a vow renewal ceremony at this time. But if you are still committed to this divorce, then I have one request. Leave in silence. Leave your rings on the table. Your kids can gather them when you leave. But leave in silence. And about that moment, I would cue up that old song by Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand. And maybe you've heard that song before. And it's something about, you don't bring me flowers anymore. Maybe you've heard that before. Oh, we're going to... Sad. Crap. That's awful. But I'm not so sure that civilization is better sometimes. I'm not so sure that doing things in non-dramatic ways is as effective as maybe these guys were back in the Old Testament era when they made covenants. They were pretty major deals. Well, God is making a covenant with Abraham here. And Abraham understands that's what God is up to. But when we look on slide number 11, you're going to see something here it's really a game changer, especially when it comes to changing our view of God. And when I'm trying to answer this question in kind of a longer way here, but how that the God of the Old Testament is still a God of love, just like He is in the New. So just stay with me. You see it here in the blood covenant. And in Genesis 15:17, this moment between God and Abraham, it takes a very intriguing turn. And see, Abraham thought that God was going to ask him to walk between the pieces in this ancient covenant, blood covenant. He thought that God was going to ask him to vow and say, I will do this or I will do that, like you did in all other blood covenants. In verse 17, when the sun had set, we read, and this has gone from day to night. Now it's a whole day that's transpired, and darkness has fallen. We're told that Abraham fell into a deep sleep in verse 12. And all the commentators say it doesn't mean he just got sleepy and fell asleep because it's been a long day. No, this is not normal sleep. Because it says a thick and dreadful darkness came over him in verse 12. And so Abraham, he finds himself in the middle of a blood path ceremony with Almighty God, and it's being dramatized right before him. And the sun sets, and he's looking at all this blood and this blood path, and he's possibly still unsure about what his terms, his side of the covenant's going to be. And so he's terrified. What is God going to be asking me to do now? What is He asking me to commit to? And so he's conscious enough to feel the dread, but he's visionary enough that he can't snap out of it. And here's why. Because at the point in the ceremony in which the lesser party, Abraham, would step into the blood and vow to be treated like the eviscerated animals in the ceremony, if he were to violate the terms of God's covenant, then God would have the opportunity, He would have the right and the permission to slay him just like the animals if he ever violated one little part of the law and the covenant of God. And it smote him with fear. But here's what happened. Thick and dreadful darkness came over him, and then Abraham does not walk through like he ordinarily would have done. Instead, what we see is a smoking fire pot. It's like a small furnace that was used to purify metal. A smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And all of these characteristics, these descriptive statements here and words are used of the presence of God on Mount Sinai. And we see smoke and furnace and fire and lightning. And so this is an unmistakable association with the glory of God. It's like the raw Shekinah glory of God. It comes to Mount Sinai later in Moses' life, but here it is showing up in Abraham's life at an ancient blood covenant ceremony where God is ratifying a promise. And He dramatizes it so that nobody would miss it. And it's the raw Shekinah glory of God. It comes flooding into that ceremony. At times, the Shekinah glory of God was like a cloudy pillar. At times, it was like a fire. But here's what it was. It was severe. And it was the presence of God. And it was a pain to even look at it. And suddenly, in the midst of the darkness, this searing streak, described as a blaze, it's like a streak of lightning comes into this scene, this ancient blood covenant scene. And you and I, we see lightning. It zaps, it flashes, it disappears. But this was unlike any lightning that he had ever seen, any blaze that he'd ever seen. It's the raw Shekinah glory of God that floods into this covenant ceremony moment just when Abraham was to be the one to walk through the ancient blood path covenant. And it comes and it stands and it stays there and it doesn't disappear. And if you can imagine the smoke and you can imagine the crackling, you can imagine the blaze and the light, imagine the radiance, imagine the sparks. It's lightning that's not going away and it's just sizzling. As it passes through the pieces. It's the presence of God. And so the fact that this ancient blood covenant ceremony does not astonish Abraham, this is what astonished him. The raw presence of God when it was his turn to walk through the pieces. The Shekinah glory of God walked through for him. Just God. God was making an unconditional covenant. No matter how often Abraham or his seed failed, God would keep His promises. He would keep working the story. He would continue to preserve the Messianic line. He would fulfill the covenant promises. They would never be rendered null and void. God stands in. He actually walks in for Abraham. And He's telling Abram, if you sin, Abram, if you're not perfect, if your descendants are not blameless, if you break the covenant in any way, you may do this to me, what's been done to these animals here. And men and women, it's at this point in the story where God sentences Himself, His Son, to die. Because there's no way Abram can keep the covenant. There's no way he can be that perfect. That's why he was smitten. That's why he was paralyzed with fear. It's why he can't bring himself to step into that blood path, because he knows what it means. And this is the moment in our story where the hero is sentenced to die. Years and years before he ever came and died on a cross. You see, God walked through the pieces alone. He did not say, now Abraham, you do it. Go ahead. It's your turn. You're going to keep this part of the covenant. Or I'm not going to love you and I'm not going to fulfill these promises. Men and women, I sat at my computer this week and just wept because this is stunning. We know this from history and archaeology, that whenever a king would enter a covenant relationship with a vassal, a lesser king or conquered king or a servant, both the king and the servant would go through the pieces. Both would say, if I don't do my part, may I be eaten by the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, and may it be done to me as these carcasses have been treated here in front of us today. But when the presence of the Shekinah glory of God goes through these pieces by Himself, God is saying, Abram, I'm going to go through for the both of us. Because you can't do this. I have to assume the responsibility for the blessings, yes, and I have to assume the responsibility for the curses. I'll be responsible for my failures, but I'll in addition be responsible for yours. The promise is that God is going to pay for His people's sins. God's going to pay the price, whether He or Abraham or his descendants violate the covenant. Either way, it's all on God. And men and women, this is the gospel. This is the story that we've fallen into. God comes through and He says, I will take upon myself the curse of the covenant for the both of us. Abram, may I be cut off if I don't do my part of the bargain. But Abram, may I be cut off if you don't do yours. I will bless you and all the nations of the world through you, even if it means, and it did, that I would have to die. You see, centuries later, darkness came down again. And we read about it in the Gospels. It'll say things at the 6th hour, say things like at the 6th hour darkness came over the whole land. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Abraham didn't know it at the time, but it was going to cost God this incredible price when the Shekinah glory of God passed through the pieces and wouldn't allow Abraham to go through. Because see, God said, I'm the only one. And I'll assume responsibility for the story and how it goes. And I'm going to assume you're part of the covenant. And I know you're going to mess it up. I know you're going to break it. But I'm going to make a provision. And so the God of the Old Testament is not a God of hatred. He's not a God that's different from the new. Oh no, friends. He's a God of love, and even clear back in Genesis 15, ratifying through ancient blood covenant with this servant Abraham, God says, I'm going to die. Self-sacrificial love. You see, this is the slaying of the warrior God of the Old Testament. Isaiah says about the Messiah, for He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people He was stricken. Isaiah writes, God's Son was cut off. He was trampled into the dust. The darkness came down on Him. And if Jesus is who He said He is, and He is, and if Jesus is the one on whom the darkness came down, and He was, and if Jesus was the one who was cut off from the land of the living, and He was, and if Jesus is the one, everything else falls into place. Neither Abraham nor the families of the world have kept our side of the covenant. We've not been loyal to our Creator God. We've broken it. But based on an ancient covenant promise made centuries ago, God Himself paid the penalty for a covenant that we ourselves had broken with Him. And so He's saying, oh Abraham, God is saying, and He's saying it to all of us, oh world, I will bless you no matter what, even if it means my immortality must take on a mortal body someday, even if my glory must be drowned in darkness, even if I have to literally be torn to pieces. And He was, because centuries later, darkness came down on the hero of our story. It's called Mount Calvary. The thick darkness comes down on Him, and in the midst of the darkness there was God in the person of Jesus, and He was literally being torn to pieces, nails, spears, thorns. Check out your story icon on your book. There's a reason there's a crown, and then a crown a king would wear, and a crown of thorns. It was Jesus, the King, who takes the covenant curse upon Himself. And a few years after the Christ event, it was Paul who said, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to us all through Jesus Christ. No, the God of the Old Testament is not something different. He's a God of love. And He's walked the blood path for you and for me. And He did it all the way back in Genesis 15. And maybe you're at a place in your spiritual life where, there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of issues maybe that's taken place in your life, and you've wondered where God has been in all of that, and you struggle with suffering in the world, and you struggle with injustices in the world, and you struggle with things like how could people groups be annihilated, and you struggle with things how animals and horses could be hamstrung, and all of these things that were done here on this occasion. But what you have to believe is that there is a God, and He's been writing a story for a long time. And He sacrificially lays Himself on the line. Not only does He deal with these kinds of issues and hold people accountable, and He does, but He's not removed from an ivory tower. He's immersed Himself in our suffering. And He says, I'm going to lay down and die for these people. And we get to the end of the book of Joshua, slide number 12, and we'll wrap it with this. Joshua 24:15. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Are you ready to do that this morning? Are you ready to say, you know what, Pastor? I'm ready. We've been in the story now 7 weeks. It's the 7th installment. And I understand what God has done for me. I'm in life situations, like you said earlier in the message, I've believed a lot of lies in my life. Things like it's too late for me to do anything different with my life, or I've messed up too much. No one's going to want me, or I'm just going to fail again. And you struggle with these kinds of notions and things that's bounced around in your head for a long time. Well, I'm here to tell you this morning, based on the ancient blood covenant, that you're loved. You're bled and you're fought for. And you've been bled for. And this morning, I don't want you walking out of here feeling like your life is a hopeless cause. You have hope because of one who continues to write a better story. And maybe today you'd like to do that. Maybe you'd like to walk that aisle right there. No, it's not an ancient blood covenant, but maybe, you know what, there's aisle ways. Maybe it's your time. Maybe it's your time to renew covenants and your commitments to your Creator God, who walked through the pieces for you and for me. Would you like to do that today? Hey, you guys, let's just tarry a few more moments. Play that final song, the story song, if you would. We're just going to sit for a moment, and we may not even play all of it, but let's just play it. It comes with the story. These are available on YouTube if you want to go back and look at them later. they kind of recommend these for some of the themes. Just sit quietly this morning for just a moment. If you'd like to for this morning, and thank you for just giving us a moment here. And we thank you for what you've done for us in and through Jesus. And we just are so glad that even though there's some crazy stuff in the Bible, and all of it coming from a rebellion of free will people, and we see that you refuse, though, to let your story be sabotaged. And you have taken necessary steps to ensure that we get to stand here today and learn about what your heart really is about. And so thank you. And I just ask and pray this morning that all of us covenant breakers here will live our lives with a new gratitude, because you walked through the pieces years ago, and you walked through for the both of us. And we want to say thank you for that. Thank you for your sacrificial love even then. Thank you for that death sentence that you gave to your son at that moment in Genesis 15. Because it's by that sentence that we all live. And we've wandered a lot of years, and we've struggled with some things in our lives, and even today we struggle. But I ask and pray that whatever direction you're asking us to go, what it is you're asking us to do, that as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Today we choose. We choose to move toward you. We choose to move toward others rather than away from them. We choose to bless. We choose to add value to our world rather than to curse, to take away from our world. We choose to add value to relationships rather than to deteriorate relationships through curses. We choose to bless, not curse. And we choose to move toward you today. As Moses said, choose life. And yet again, Joshua says, choose this day whom you will serve. And that's what we want to do. We want to serve the one true God who walked between the pieces for us. So you guide us today now, and you help us to live in light of these truths. And thank you so much for being a sacrificial loving God. We're forever grateful. And we intend to live our lives in light of what you've done. And we lean into this truth, and we need this truth today. And thank you for it. For it's a bedrock on which we want to build our lives, even our new life. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys. You've been great. We got through some thorny issues. Stand with me, okay? Blessings to you. Installment number 8, chapter 8, next week. We'll see you then. And get into the scriptures are great. Jeff will vouch for that. Blessings. Have a great week.